Hello everybody, I'm Aurelio De Rosa and I want to welcome you to Introduction to Grunt. In this screencast, you will learn what Grunt is and what is it good for, how to install Grunt, what a task is, how to install, update and delete a task, and finally how to configure and run some basic tasks. To use Grunt, you only need two things: Node.js and a command line interface. So, what is Grunt? Grunt, sometimes referred as Grunt.js, is defined as a task runner for JavaScript. This means that this tool can speed up your workflow by automating repetitive tasks of a project, like minifying JavaScript and CSS files, removing unused CSS declarations from your style sheets, and parse CSS files to add vendor prefixes where needed. Grunt is not the only task runner available for JavaScript, but it's surely one of the most important and mature projects at the moment. It's also the tool with the largest amount of tasks and the one that started the whole fashion of the task runners. Finally, its ecosystem is grown a lot, and we will easily find anything we may need for our projects. A task is a plugin that performs one or more actions. For example, there are tasks to copy files, tasks to minify JavaScript files, to compress images to reduce their weight, and much more. To install Grunt, you need to create a file called package.json containing the tasks you want to use, including Grunt itself. Then you have to run on the command line interface the command npm install. For those of you who don't know what npm is, it is the Node Packages Manager, and it's installed when you install Node.js. The result of running this command is the creation of a folder called Node Modules, containing a folder for each of the tasks defined. Package.json is a file written using the JSON format that is used to store the metadata of the project. Here, you will list the Grunt plugins your project needs as dev dependencies, including Grunt itself. This file should be stored in the root directory of your project. But how a package.json looks like, you may ask. A basic example of a package.json is shown in the slide. You can see that I've defined a name for the project using the name property and its version using the version property. Then I set the dependencies property to an empty object, because our project is not an npm module, so it doesn't need any task for the production environment. In the dev dependencies property, I defined the tasks needed. In this example, I have included Grunt and a couple of other tasks. Tasks are included setting their name as a property and the version we want to use as a value. In the engines property, I specified the version of Node that we want to work on. Now, let's see how to install Grunt. To start, create a folder and name it my-project. Inside it, create a file called package.json. Now open it with your text editor of choice or your IDE. And let's type an empty object. Here we will define the properties of our project. So let's start with the name. As we said, we will call it my project. And then let's define its version. We will start with version 1.0.0. Next, we will define an empty object for the dependencies, as we have already said. We need to define the tasks that our project will use. To start, let's define Grunt. We will use version 0.4.1. And then let's define Grunt contrib clean, and we will use version 0.5.0. Finally, we will also define the task grunt contrib concat, and we will use version 0.3.0. Finally, we will define the engines. Note, and we require a version greater than or equal to 0.10.0. Once done, save the file, close it, and open your command line interface, and then type npm install. As you can see, the tool will install the tasks that we defined and create a folder called node modules. Inside it, we have the three tasks that we have defined: grunt, grunt contrib clean, and grunt contrib concat. Now that we have seen how to install Grunt, let's see some frequently used tasks. Grunt contrib clean clears files and folders. Grunt contrib copy copies files and folders. Grunt contrib concat concatenates files. And then we have CSS min, CSS lint, watch, and then we have grunt and CSS that removes unused CSS declarations from your project. JS hint that validates files with JS hint, image min that minifies PNG and JPEG images, and finally HTML min that minifies HTML code. In your projects, you will be only interested in installing tasks for development purposes. So, to install a task, you have to run on the command line interface the command npm install the task name --save -dev. For example, npm install grunt-uncss -save -dev. To update a task, run the command npm update and the task name. For example, npm update grunt-uncss. Sometimes you also want to delete a task. To delete a task, you have to run the command npm uninstall and then the task name. For example, npm uninstall grunt-uncss. To use Grunt, you also need to create a file called gruntfile.js, often referred as grunt file. It is a configuration file for Grunt, written in pure JavaScript that belongs to the root directory of your project. A Grunt file is made of the following sections: the wrapper function, project and task configuration, loading Grunt plugins and tasks, and some custom tasks. To use Grunt, you don't need to understand all these parts. They exist because Grunt is integrated in the Node.js environment. So, we will start with a boilerplate and see how to configure a task and how to run it. The following is the gruntfile.js boilerplate. As you can see, we have all the parts that we have previously described. Let's now see a couple of examples of task configuration. This example illustrates how you can configure the concat task. Here you can see that we have defined three source JavaScript files that are source first.js, source second.js, and source third.js, and we want to concatenate these files into one file called build.js and place it in the this folder. Another example is the uglify configuration. Here we are required to concatenate and minify two JavaScript files that are input1.js and input2.js into a file called output.min.js, which should be stored in the des folder. Let's now see an example of how we can use Grunt. In this specific case, we will use the task called Grunt Contrib Uglify. To start, let's open up the command line interface and point it. The first thing we need to do is to install that task. To do so, type npm install grunt-contrib-uglify and then press enter. npm will install the task for us. Once done, open up the folder. Inside the folder, I have created another folder called source, and inside it I have two JavaScript files that we are going to concatenate and minify. I have also created a grunt file.js. Inside it, I have placed the boilerplate that we have seen in the previous slide. Here we will configure grunt contrib uglify to do what we expected, that is, to concatenate and minify the two JavaScript files that I have showed you previously. So let's type uglify. Then inside it we need to define the name of a target. In this case we will write dist. Inside it we have to define the files that we want to work on. The first thing that we want to define is the name of the file that we want to create. We will name it output.min.js, and this file should be stored in a folder called dest. This file should be the result of the concatenation and the minification of the following files: source input1.js and source input2.js. Now we need to load the grunt contrib uglify task. So here we have to write grunt contrib uglify. We have already done, but we also will define a default task, and the default task will run our uglify task. So we have to write uglify. Once done, you can save the file and close it. At this point, open up the command line interface and just type grunt and then press enter. As you can see, the tool returned a success message. In fact, inside the test folder we have an output.min.js that contains the result we expected, as you can see here. So, to wrap up, Grunt is a great tool that can speed up your workflow by automating repetitive tasks for your project, like minifying JavaScript and CSS files, compressing images, and checking your code for style errors. In the previous example, we have seen just one of those tasks, but you can use as many as you like. I hope you liked it and that you will employ Grunt in your next project. If you want to discuss about Grunt or anything else, get in touch with me using my email address a.derosa@audero.it or on Twitter. Bye bye!